Uh, Good evening, everyone, and a privilege to be talking to you. We have the privilege of welcoming the Minister, Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan, to inaugurate the session. And following that, we'll have a moderated discussion with some very esteemed panelists. So without much further ado, Minister.
Good evening, friends. My dear friend Neelkanth Mishra, Martha Crawford, Mr. Andreas Cremer, Mr. Eytan, Sheshinski, conference participants from India and abroad, friends from media, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me congratulate Gateway House and Ministry of External Affairs to launch this conference in Mumbai. With august participation of India and international political and business leaders. The sessions yesterday and today cover a wide range of issues which are of immense contemporary importance and straddle with world of business, politics and international relations. I am glad that this discussion is taking place in Mumbai, which is India's industrial and financial capital. Besides, Mumbai has been in the forefront of leading Indian oil and gas industry, starting from hosting the first two refineries after independence, to Mumbai high oil, the gas production and processing facilities, to begin supply of domestic LPG, Mumbai has remained in the front line of providing energy security for India. The topic selected by organizer is very relevant for the present time. In the last 2 years, I have tried to understand the geopolitics of oil and gas. With all candidness, I can say that it is a complex subject. When I took over as minister in May 2014, oil was hovering around $105 to $110 per barrel. At that time, IASS started inching towards Baghdad, and speculation was rife that oil may reach around $150 to $200 per barrel. I spent some sleepless nights at this, as this could have had serious implications for consumers and general economy in India. This forecast was proven wrong, and you all know about the downward oil price spiral that started in second half of 2014, which took it down to $26 per barrel. The topic of discussion of this session, the geopolitics of energy, intends to capture the current and possible future dynamics wherein the ground is shifting and goalposts and players are changing. Geopolitics is of immense importance due to its ingrained capacity to create sudden and disruptive pressure on the operations of global energy assets and energy supplies. Certainly, energy lies at the heart of political, economic and environmental interests of not just for India, but global community at whole. It's a complex but very important and interesting issue. Questions which immediately come to my mind are whether the center of gravity of the world of energy is shifting outside the Middle East. Are traditional hydrocarbon-rich countries being overtaken in importance by new developed and developing countries displayed globally? Is financialization of the energy market playing a larger than ever role in oil prices? Will oil and gas remain preeminent source of energy, or will renewable poses a challenge to their historical supremacy? These are some of the questions which may be on the top of our minds during this session. Friends, in my address, I will try to capture some of these trends being observed both in geopolitics of energy as well as the financial and technology dimensions of oil and gas. I will then speak about the impact of this change for India. I will also share on what India is doing in the face of this changing oil and gas canvas. Let me make 8 quick observations on recent development in oil and gas. First, the center of gravity of oil supply has shifted outside of the Middle East. Countries like USA, Russia, Canada, Australia, countries from Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and few other countries have also emerged as major suppliers of oil and gas linked to a changed energy landscape. There has been new level of energy cooperation between these countries with energy importing countries which were never seen before. Few examples are China-Turkmenistan gas pipeline, China-Russia multi-billion-dollar gas pipeline, Indian investment in energy resource of Russia, Africa and Latin America, Indian plans to source LNG from US, Australia, etc. 2. Major consumers of importers of oil and gas are now countries from Asia like China, India, Japan and South Korea. This trend is likely to continue in future. It is certain that buyers will have a more bargaining power vis-a-vis the supplier than in the past. The re-entry of Iran after lifting of sanctions has changed dynamics and dimension, making processes within OPEC. The OPEC meeting in Doha in April and Vienna earlier this month reflect the role of OPEC will play, or better said, will not play in the world of oil and in the near future. Loosening of OPEC's hold on the oil market with more non-OPEC oil is a significant development. 4. New source of oil and gas, emergence of cost-effective alternate forms of energy have forced many oil-dependent economy to start thinking of a post-oil economy. As articulated by Saudi Arabia in the Vision 2030, there are arguments that there is a self-balancing mechanism of oil prices that has developed in the market now. While continued low oil prices have slowed down the US shale production and Canadian oil sands, they will rebound if the oil price go up again, thereby having control on price rise for longer periods. 5. Technology has brought some good news. It has brought some certainty in this ever-changing world of oil and gas. Advanced drilling, seismic and recovery technology, more accurate data analysis, efficient refining, better conservation techniques, modern pipelines, and marketing infrastructure have emerged as key drivers enabling us to extract more oil and gas. Technology has also enabled fracking, which turned the world's largest energy consumer into a potential exporter. Technology has also helped create alternatives for fossil fuels. Prices of renewable energy, especially solar, have fallen sharply in the past 5 years. Electric vehicles technology has also improved in a big way. These technologies can end up reducing the demand for fossil fuels at a time when supply is going up. 6. Price volatility is not new to oil and gas markets. Oil prices have been on a roller coaster ride several times. Last 20 years have seen price move between $16 to $125. I do not think that the current price volatility is entirely due to supply-demand reasons. Historically, oil has very rarely obeyed the supply-demand logic. Prices have been guided by geopolitical events, particularly wars in Middle East, as in 1967 and 1973, global financial downturns like 1997, Asian meltdown, and 2008 global financial collapse, or oligopolistic decision of cartels. This time there seems to be a host of reasons for sustaining the price of such as US reaching near self-sufficiency due to shale revolution, new oil producers coming to export market, lack of unanimity within OPEC, discovery of new fossil fuel source, and financialization of the oil market. 7. Financial players with no interest in fiscal oil have been able to direct the price of oil. Hedge fund, insurance companies, high net worth investors have become active in this sector, adding more players and more uncertainty of oil prices. In the past few decades, a variety of instruments that permit speculation in oil have been introduced in form of futures, options, exchange trade funds and derivatives. There have even been calls for policy intervention to limit financial participation. Whether financial players bring improvement in market efficiency or bring in more volatility is a moot question. I think distinguished financial market experts like Mr. Mishra and panel can ably debate the relative advantage and disadvantage of this. 8th point, despite growing prospect of cost effectiveness of renewable energy, oil and gas will remain a predominant source of energy. The world of petrochemical has emerged as a ever-expanding sector and is probably affecting daily life of human beings more than what oil has done as transportation fuel. Moreover, thanks to massive surge of LNG, transitional gas pipeline role of natural gas in energy baskets of many countries are going to increase. Natural gas will also act as a complement to renewable energy in many cases. The point I am trying to make is that the energy market is changing fast. We are moving in a direction where there are growing number of sellers, role of cartels is diminishing, technology is opening new pathways, and for a change, buyers have a role in price determination. The actors who have the capacity to alter the oil market are numerous now. The good thing is that we are in a better situation where present price level look like new normal. Friends, India is geopolitically located in a neighborhood which is rich in resource but with several complexities. Middle East and Iran are our next door maritime neighbors, but we have not been able to get advantage from it for several reasons. We are still struggling for having short distance gas pipelines from Turkmenistan despite having mutual willingness. We remain worried about geopolitical development in Middle East, Africa, Latin America and elsewhere, while tension between Sudan and South Sudan is affecting our investment. We left our operations in many countries like Syria, Libya, and Egypt due to geopolitical disturbance there. Low oil and gas prices have benefited countries like India by reducing the import bill significantly and also reducing cost of power, fertilizer and other industrial output which are dependent on oil and gas. It has brought smiles to many faces in India. The energy sector is an important pillar of our economic aspiration. As you are aware, India imports about 80% of its oil and 37% of its gas requirement. Last year alone, India imported 202 million metric ton of crude oil. Although the per capita energy consumption of India is about 1/3 of global average, we are already the world's 4th largest importer of oil and gas, and projection is in energy outlooks of OPEC, IEA, and BP forecast energy consumption of India is going to increase. According to many forecasts, over 90% of growth in world energy consumption in next 20 years will come from India and China. Energy access is a fundamental requirement, and the government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi is committed to provide reliable and affordable energy to all segments of society. Access to energy is a critical sustaining our rapidly growing economy at over 7% annum and to satisfy the ever-growing needs and aspirations of the people. In the last 2 years, we have successfully targeted subsidy in LPG in terms of who will get it and by giving directly in the bank account of the consumers. We are now beginning to implement the same in kerosene. LPG network is going to get massive boost in coming 3 years with the Pradhan Ujjwala Yojana, under which 50 million new BPL households will be connected with the subsidized LPG at a discounted price. Petrol and diesels are deregulated. Products and private sectors have started to reopen their retail network across India, bringing more choice for consumers. We are expanding our refining capacity to meet our domestic demands as well as to become an international hub for refined products. I am sure most of you are familiar about Gujarat story, where even village and small business units are connected with piped natural gas. Gas forms 25% of the energy basket in Gujarat, which is higher than international standard of 24%. We are serious to implement the same model across India. We are also in process of expanding use of natural gas in transportation segment. A robust network of LNG terminal is being planned on the east coast and few additional terminals in the west coast. Our voluntary commitment in Paris during COP21 also make it necessary to increase the volume of gas in our energy basket. There have been efforts to promote biofuels like ethanol and biodiesel in our major way. Honorable Prime Minister set up a challenging target of reducing 10% of our oil and gas import by 2022. We are therefore working hard to boost domestic exploration and production by modernizing our infrastructure, introducing policy reforms and ease of doing business for both public and private sectors. India has recently launched 67 discovered small fields for which bidding will commence in mid-July. These were lying unmonetized for years. The government has already announced hydrocarbon exploration and licensing policy with most progressive features in it. Bills under this policy will be launched shortly. To insulate India from the uncertainty of geopolitics and volatility, we have diversified our imports of oil and gas from various sources. We source about 85% of our oil requirement from Middle East, 58% of our oil requirement from Middle East, and 20% is from Africa and Latin America. We are also diversifying our gas sourcing. We have reformed the crude procurement process of oil PSU, thereby having huge amount in import bill. Acquisition of assets of hydrocarbon has also been priority. Our portfolio includes assets of 25 countries. Last month, ONGC Videsh acquired 15% stake in Vankor field in Russia. Our efforts at energy diplomacy are being spearheaded by Prime Minister himself. Prime Minister visited almost all important oil and gas producing countries in past 2 years, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, Qatar, UAE, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, USA, Mexico, etc. He is scheduled to visit 4 African countries next month following the organization of a highly successful India-Africa Forum Summit in October last year. He played leading role in renegotiating for asset acquisition of Russia and LNG price revision with Qatar. I have myself made visits to countries like Saudi Arab, Iran, Russia, Qatar, UAE, Turkmenistan, Nigeria, Mozambique, Colombia, Mexico, Vietnam to shore up our energy security. We are also engaging in pipeline such as TAPI, which could supply us at least 40 mmCMD of gas once operational. I think I have shared my thoughts and it is time to hear our other panelists and then have a discussion. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Minister. That was very insightful, and I must say you covered a very broad range of topics. Gives us a lot of food for thought. What we do now is I will give a short introduction to the discussion. Then we'll have the panelists speak for 5 minutes each. Then we do a moderated Q&A, and the last 10 minutes we will have audience Q&A. The questions have to be passed on. I'm sure by now you're used to it, to Elvira and Kunal. And then they will be forwarding the questions to us. Energy and geopolitics have, as you know, always been closely linked as energy has been a major reason for countries to engage with each other. In fact, some would say that many wars were won because of a particular choice of energy. And some people say the First World War, the choice of oil over coal had a big role to play. Energy has also played a very big role in geopolitics in the last decade, particularly as prices rose, because the oil exporters also generated large surpluses of capital. And that capital deployment actually provided big bargaining power to them as well. Now, there are dramatic changes that are unfolding on both the demand side and on the supply side. So on the demand side, what is fascinating is that the countries that added up to 60% of energy demand in 2000, that is the US, the Eurozone, Japan, Russia, and Canada, these countries have seen a decline in energy consumption over the last 15 years. So they're actually down 2%. On the other hand, in the last 5 years, nearly 71% of all new energy demand has actually come from India and China. And as the minister said, in the next 20 years, right, I have a little mic. So as in the next 20 years, as the minister said, we are going to see 85% of incremental energy demand coming from the Indo-Pacific region. And that has a very, very important role in defining the geopolitics. So, so this region will have to start playing a much bigger role going forward in international geopolitics. On the supply side, there are other big changes happening. There is, renewables are only about 3% of world energy demand, but in the last year, in the last 1 year, they were 38% of incremental energy supply. So, so they are already starting to play a very big role. The forecasts are being revised up almost every year. But and renewables, while the geopolitics of renewables actually has not been very well understood, particularly given that renewables by definition are available everywhere. So you have sunlight everywhere. You can have biodiesel, biomass everywhere. You can have wind. Almost every country has access to it. So it almost makes it irrelevant to engage with other countries. If in an ideal world we only had renewables, but that's too simplistic, because renewables by definition are intermittent. So you need storage. Storage needs again very rare materials. You need lithium. You need flake graphite. A very large percentage of the world reserves of lithium are in the Atacama Desert in Argentina. China is 65% of flake graphite production. So will the control of these resources then be the next big challenge for the world in the next 20 years? And those are questions that we can discuss in the panel. Then the impact of technology. The minister mentioned the impact of fracking, the impact of shale, the impact of energy efficiency. I would add to that technologies like HVDC, the high voltage direct current lines, where you can transport energy without meaningful losses over large distances. And the access to these can actually become advantageous, and we can discuss if there can be some geopolitics around that. But it is important to not to overemphasize renewables. While the renewable adoption will be the fastest in history of any fuel source, so oil went to 10% of energy supply in the world over 40 years. Gas reached 8% over 50 years. Renewables are expected to reach about 8 to 10%. The forecast is 8, let's say 10 in the next 20 years. But that's still only 10%. In fact, the fastest growing source of supply, energy supply, is going to be gas. And the minister brought forward some very important points about the importance of pipelines, the technology of liquefaction, and those are again things that I think we will discuss. So there's a lot to discuss. We have a great panel with us. Allow me to introduce them. We have Dr. Martha Crawford. She's an international expert on energy business and technologies who has recently joined the Harvard Business School. She holds a PhD in engineering from Harvard as well, and is an MBA from the French, let me say, College of Engineers. I think that's how we'll translate that. Oh yeah, okay. And then we have Dr. Andreas Cremer and Professor Sheshinski from Israel. So we'll start with Martha and go around, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Is it on? Yes, okay. Yes, thank you for giving me the floor. I just wanted to emphasize, you asked the question, what is the role of technologies and technological innovation in these changes that we're seeing in the geopolitical situation? I guess one of the obvious answers is that changes in extraction technology, in the last 10, 15 years, made tight oil and shale gas available in the United States, and that has completely shifted the balance of power with the United States going from being a net importer to very soon a net exporter. But beyond that, as was just mentioned, there has been a decoupling in OECD countries between economic growth and energy consumption. And to a large extent, that's because finally we start to see the policies that we've been putting in place since 1992, since the UN Climate Change Convention, which was signed in 1992. We started putting in place a lot of policies at that time to try to encourage energy efficiency in the built sector, in appliances, and finally those are starting to have a bite. So what we saw is we had a big crisis in 2008, 2009. Energy demand went way off, and what we've seen since then in most of the OECD countries, and you mentioned Russia as well, but I think that's for slightly different reasons. Anyway, what we've seen is as economic growth comes back, the demand for energy does not. And in that respect, what we see is that finally those policies are bearing fruit. At the same time, the production technologies for renewables have become mass-produced and massively deployed, particularly for solar and wind, in some countries also for biofuels. What has been behind these changes has been that there has been a regulatory framework put in place, financing mechanisms put in place. So it's not only the technological innovation, that would be too easy. And I think if you look at the case here in India, why it's not going as fast as some would hope is mainly because we've had a lot of financing difficulties, for example, some regulatory uncertainty. So those conditions can never be forgotten. It's not only just a question of access to innovation, technological innovation. So what we see with the large-scale deployment of renewables is a decentralized production. And I guess the question that's being posed is, going forward, how will that impact? I would add to that it's not only decentralized production, we're also seeing decentralized consumption. We used to see consumption on the basis of a factory or the basis of a household, and what we're seeing now is more car sharing, more partial consumption, or people being able to order the heating system in their house to go off during peak hours, or program their dishwasher so that it runs when electricity is cheapest. So what we're seeing, in fact, for me, I'm happy to talk about energy technologies and innovation, but what I think what we're seeing is what is changing in the energy sector is really only symptomatic of a larger paradigm shift that we're seeing in Europe. We often call it the fourth industrial revolution. That industrial revolution is going beyond, and if you want to, the first revolution we say is water and steam, when we went towards mechanization. Then we had electricity, which ushered in mass production. Then electronics and IT, which introduced automation. And now the fourth industrial revolution is driven by digital technologies, where we see a fusion between physical, virtual, and biological sciences. So things are no longer so cut and dried. And in fact, that's impacting the energy sector just as in every other sector. So for me, we can talk about the energy technology innovation, but in fact, it's part of a larger scale. What we see is digital is influencing the way we consume and the way we produce, and it's going to lead to smart grids, smart cars. It's going to completely turn on its head the way we do things. Now, countries like India and China are to some extent caught between two doors, because on the one hand, you're still building up your base load, coal and nuclear. You need, until we have massive storage, unfortunately, we need a base load. We need to be able to produce massive amounts of energy that are going to keep the lights on and are going to keep the factories going. Today, we don't have the storage capacity to make sure that we can store a gigawatt of electricity, and so we don't need that. So when you've got 300 million people in India who still don't have electricity, you have to think about building up coal and nuclear and other, could be gas. But you have to do that, and at the same time, try to figure out how you're going to surf on this wave of renewables and the new energy future which is coming in. I have great hope. I'll stop there. I think India is very well positioned for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Dr. Kramer, if you can.
Yes, thank you. If an alien from outer space came to look at Earth and study the energy system, they would say to one another, the humans, they're great. They have geothermal energy, they have the ocean energy, they know how to harvest the sunlight that is captured by the plants and biomass. They know how to harvest electricity directly from the sun and the wind. And yet, with all the assets that they have, with all the technology, they're still killing one another over oil. And with that one, I want to start reflecting what the geopolitics of energy, of the new energy, of the renewable energy, of the decentralized energy will look like. And it will be very different to the geopolitics, the shift that has happened with the new oil and fossil methane that came out of fracking. I think what is important to understand is that in 2015, the world entered the episode and the range of parity. Solar power on land, including storage, and onshore wind on land are now cheaper than new coal. They're cheaper than new gas-fired power plants. In some parts of the world, they're so cheap now that they are driving fossil energies and nuclear energy out of the market. They're closing nuclear power plants in even old ones that are written off, the ones that have just been refurbished, so they have a license extension, and that they are shut down because they're uneconomical. The existing plants can't compete with the new energies in some geographies. What this tells us is that in spite of all the drawbacks, and I'll come back to the word intermittency, in spite of all the drawbacks, from now on, all new investment will be directed towards renewable energy, the smart grid that you mentioned, and we need to think about the storage. And any money that from now on goes into new investment in the old energy, in the fossil energy and in the nuclear energy will be wasted. It's as simple as that. It hasn't been understood everywhere, and there is still momentum in the investment planning and in the investment rules and the creditworthiness assessment of financial backers and things like that. But in essence, that is what is happening. So the future is very bright for the renewables. And the green energy shift, as the Canadians call it, is economically, it's not driven by policy anymore. This is not an ideology. This is driven by economics. Economically, the green energy shift is now self-sustaining, it is self-accelerating, and it is self-replicating everywhere in the world. Let me say this to Martha. If there are 300 million people in India that have not been reached by modern energy in the form of electricity, then building nuclear plants and building coal plants and then rolling out the grid to reach those villages is going to be too costly and it's going to be too slow. It's simply going to be easier and cheaper and much more satisfactory to allow those families and those villages to invest their own money in microgrids based on renewables, storage, and low voltage direct current smart energy systems. They cost very little. They can be assembled in India. The parts you need to buy, they're mostly made in China, but the assembly is something that anybody can do who can repair a motorcycle. That is the level of technological awareness that you need to have. That is where it will go. What does it mean for the geopolitics, our original question? And I would like to separate the security issues and the economic issues. The security issues are this. The renewable energies that you harvest from the environmental flows on your territory, they're essentially non-deniable by enemy action. Short of a full invasion of India, nobody can stop your energy supply as you could by disrupting the supply routes or by destabilizing the exporting countries. So there is a direct security policy benefit in that respect. As a consequence of oil no longer fetching the high prices that it did in the past, and even with a peak this year, we are still 30% lower than we were at this time last year. So, and last year, the oil companies were bleeding money. This year, they're bleeding more money all the time. With that, there is less money available for the upkeep of the autocratic regimes that are the result of what is known as the resource curse. Countries where you have rent-seeking behavior because their natural resources, they tend to have very poor governance, they tend to produce autocratic regimes, they tend to export people and conflict. There is another security policy benefit by denying income to the autocratic regimes that sit on the oil. I can make the same argument about the Dutch disease, which afflicts richer countries with good governance structures, but I'll leave it there. There's another one, and that has to do with nuclear proliferation. You know, nuclear power was never economic, never. It is the only technology that has a negative learning curve. Within each generation of nuclear power plants, they got more expensive over time. And from one generation of nuclear power plants to the next, they also got more expensive. It's unique in that it gets more expensive the more we learn about it. It has never been economically viable. So anywhere in the world where there is a civilian nuclear program, it is explained only by 3 factors. One is collective economic delusion on a grand scale. I wouldn't exclude that. So the second one is corruption. I wouldn't exclude that, but it plays differently in different countries. And the third one is military intent, very often unstated, but very often the true reason. Now, by denying the credibility of civilian nuclear power, we are removing a large threat to the world, not only in the nuclear weapons in an interstate conflict, but also the risk of nuclear material falling into wrong hands, including terrorists. Two more ideas, things about the geopolitics in economic terms. One is because the new energy is so much cheaper to build and so much cheaper to run, it will actually have very small capital value compared to the existing energy system. We need to think about what that means. There will be less investment opportunities, there will be less capital formation, there will be less cross-border investment, it will change the relationships between nations. And similarly on trade. At the moment we trade the equipment for extracting energy resources, and then we trade the energy resources that we've taken out of the ground. We have multiplied our trade volume. In the future, we'll only be trading long-term, long-lasting energy equipment, and then we will harvest in all the places in the world the environmental flows that come free of charge. So the economic value, the price of the whole energy sector, the turnover, the annual turnover will plummet. And that will have consequences for GDP figures because wasteful economic behavior counts great in GDP, and it will erode the tax base. The taxman, your colleague, the Minister of Finance, will rue the day when suddenly the energy does not provide as much taxable activity in the economy anymore. So that is another, I think, important implication in the international economic relations between nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kraemer. That was very, very insightful, and I think that's a great lead into Professor Sheshinski, the support of autocratic nations and the price of energy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Gateway House for organizing this conference and for inviting me to this high quality. I enjoyed the sessions this morning. I thought the major contribution I can make to this conference is by describing to you what happens in the western part of Asia. And Asia was mentioned in the morning a number of times. It was always the Central Asia and the Far East, but I would like to focus on the area which I know quite well and come from, namely the western part of Asia, the Mediterranean, the Middle East. But let me start actually with some comments on the sovereign funds that were mentioned here again. In the morning, by the way, there were several sovereign funds were mentioned in relation also to the issue of pensions. You may know that the 2 largest sovereign funds in the world are Qatar and Norway's, each one of them around $950 billion. The Norwegian fund has been the name has been changed, and that's symbolic, to the state pension fund. They want to support from the fund the pensions, the state, the benefits paid to retirees due to longevity. Most social security systems in the world are in trouble because of good thing, longevity, but creates financial problems for public pension systems. Sovereign funds have a justification ideologically because we are talking about exhaustible resources, resources which will end in a finite time, let's say 30 years, a particular deposit of gas or oil, and there's no reason why the income from that should not be spread over future generations longer than the existence of the deposit itself. And therefore the fund is supposed to be sustainable over a long period. Now, one can argue that governments, far-sighted governments, would take care of that long sight by investing in infrastructure and so forth. But de facto, we know political considerations, realistic considerations, will say the sovereign funds are intended actually as a political economy, as a constraint on government spending. Spread it over time, have certain statutes, like the Norwegian fund, spending only interest income and capital gains, so the fund is sustainable indefinitely. And it's a constraint on government, so it's political economy. You should know that there are about 35 to 40 funds, sovereign funds in the world. The record is very checkered, mixed in some funds in Africa in particular, Chad, Niger, Cameroon, and so forth, have been robbed by the governments. The temptation is obvious. Others are very successful. I mentioned Norway, the most successful fund. But basically, funds are therefore should be seen in the context of political economy. And the statutes are very important on the spending rules, on how they should move for long-term project and so forth. I said I would like to focus on the situation, both political and economic, in the area in the Middle East. The dramatic changes in the energy sector, in the prices of oil and gas, have not escaped, of course, that region, and perhaps it's actually the focus of what happens in that region, in the economy. And I will talk about both the economics and the politics soon. It started with the background. To backtrack now, the background is that in the 1990s of the last century, the American Geological Survey found out that the eastern basin of the Mediterranean is promising for gas and oil. And indeed, shortly afterwards, in Egypt, they found large deposits of gas, offshore gas, and then in Israel, some offshore gas. Israel, for example, has now, with 2 or 3 of the deposits that were found, total trillion BCM, billion cubic meters. And in Egypt, larger, about 1.5 billion, 1.5 trillion BCM. Cyprus has about 600 billion cubic meters across from Israel and Egypt, and then Lebanon has just now auctioned out bids, asking for bids to extract gas offshore Lebanon. The method used by all governments was outsourcing. I think that's the right way. Governments are not very good in these issues, particularly deep water deposits. They require technical know-how. There are perhaps a dozen or so firms that can do that efficiently, so the outsourcing was done. But the issue always is, what are the type of contracts? How do the governments get their fair share, being the owner of the deposit? You know, by the way, that the only country in which this is not the case is the United States. In the United States, if you have a property in Texas and you find oil in your yard, it's yours. In all other countries, if you go deeper, what is underground is owned by the sovereign, by the state. Of course, the state has to compensate you for whatever expenses you had, but whatever the resources owned by the state. This is not a minor issue. It came up in court cases because when I dealt with various committees that looked at how the government can get its fair share, this is always coming up: property rights, the expectation principle, as lawyers call it. The government, this is a fiscal contract. You're outsourcing, and the government will get its share. How? By fiscal instruments, taxes in particular. The tax issue is not a minor one in itself. In most African countries, for example, the government is getting its share, the government take, by royalties. Royalties are taxes that are imposed on revenue, while excess profits or rent taxes, which are the one advocated by economists, are on profits, namely revenue minus costs. The reason is practical. Most of the manipulations that the large corporations can make is on the cost side, and therefore, if you don't have a diligent and a credible regulatory process, you better impose it on revenues rather than on profits, namely revenue minus costs. We went for the profits for the excess profits tax. Excess profits means there are models to show you what is excess profits, what is a normal profit. There are models, capital asset pricing models, which will say what are the normal profits that can be earned over a long time, and the time horizon is important in those things. The 3 stages: explorations, where the risk is most, then the development, and then the production. And it may take 6 to 8 years to develop it from the explorations, from the finding to the production itself. Every rig can cost around $10 billion, so we're talking about serious money. And time will have to be compensated by interest, so I won't go into the technical issues, but if you impose rent taxes, you have to take account also of the time that elapsed where these firms have incurred costs. So the situation as it looked in the 2010, 2020 was as follows. Israel had about a trillion BCM, Egypt about a trillion. Now there were 2 large additional findings that the Italian company has found, one Zuhur near Egypt, and which will now make it $1.5 billion, $1.5 billion. And Cyprus has, as I said, 600 billion cubic meters. And so the Middle East will be an exporter of gas eventually. The local consumption, for example, of Israel is about 7 to 8 billion a year. Egypt about the same, about 10. Jordan much less. There are countries which would be completely dependent on importation. For example, Jordan, and I'll come to Turkey, which is a major focus for exporting gas in the future from the countries which I mentioned. Jordan has received gas from Egypt until the contract broke down. There was the Arab Spring, and the contract was terminated. And Jordan will now depend totally on importation, either from Israel or from Egypt. It's from Egypt. Now, as you know, gas can be exported in 2 ways. One in natural form for short and for medium range distances, and then in liquefaction. You cool the gas, you liquefy it, it's then transported as a liquid, and then deliquefied at the destination. Countries in the Far East are, Japan, for example, are dependent completely on liquefied gas. The liquefaction adds to the cost, about $4 per heat unit, MMBTU. Is this a sign for me or whatever? I'll be short on that. Now, I said I want to say something also about the politics. Now, Egypt has 2 liquefaction plants which are idle because of the history of which I just described, and Israel may export to that. It has a contract already to export some gas to those 2 liquefaction from there to Europe. But I think the major focus will be Turkey. Turkey depends now on about 40% of Turkey's gas is supplied by Gazprom from Russia. And I think Turkey would like to diversify its sources for obvious reasons. And that's why Gazprom also suggested to become a partner in the Israeli gas deposits. It has not been signed yet, but Gazprom certainly wanted Israel not to intervene in its domination in the European market. You know, Germany and the other countries the dominant role is about the supply of gas from Gazprom, from Russia. And the Europeans would like also to diversify the sources of gas. So a word about the politics. Obviously, the fact that the US became the largest energy producer in the world because of fracking, surpassing Saudi Arabia, will change the politics of the region, if not now, then in the near future. The US is less dependent, will be less, and the world will be less dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And it's already reflected, observers are saying, in the fact that the US is less intensively involved in the conflict, the various conflicts, Syria, other conflicts in the Middle East, Iraq, in other conflicts in the Middle East. This is certainly going to continue. And the structure, therefore, the politics of the Middle East are changing. So just two more remarks. For example, Israel and Turkey had ups and downs in their relations due to various reasons. But now the convergence of interest because of the gas will bring about an agreement on supply, on a pipeline from Israel through the Mediterranean to Turkey and from there to Europe. And that's certainly welcome both by Europe and by Turkey. And this will happen. Another issue that certainly will have an effect is that Israel will supply, as I said, gas to Jordan in a natural form. It's a short distance, and then also to the Palestinian Authority. So, just the last remark is about Cyprus. Cyprus, is also divided between the Greek part and the Turkish part. Cyprus found large deposits mainly in the Greek part, and the Turkey objected to the deposits before a peace agreement, on a full agreement on Cyprus has been reached. I suggested to the Cypriot government actually to do the following. Turkey will allow to extract the gas right now, but all the revenue that the government in Cyprus, the Greek government, will receive will be put in a sovereign fund, which will not be used until after an agreement, and then an agreement will be reached on how to divide the expenditures of that fund later on. It seems that both parties are considering that suggestion, so here you can see that it can also bring some rationality into the possibility of peace in Cyprus and in other regions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So that's the end of the prepared remarks. In the interest of time, and I understand there would be quite a few questions from the audience, so we are skipping the moderated Q&A and moving straight to the audience Q&A. So as a reminder again, if you have any questions, please pass them along to Elvira and Kunal.
Thank you very much. The first question is squarely in the realm of geopolitics. You'll see why. It's a question from Liu Zhongji of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies, asking, what is India's stance on the energy alliance of Asian countries and BRICS energy alliance?
You will appreciate recently Prime Minister Modi initiated a step where he has formed a solar alliance. All those countries are primarily will be dominated by solar-based power, solar-based energy. We have formed an alliance. That beyond, we are preparing ourselves as India as a country, as a energy hub for the lot of Asian countries. India is now supplying energy to Nepal, India is supplying energy to Sri Lanka, India is supplying energy to Bangladesh, India is supplying energy to Bhutan. We are planning, now we are talking to Myanmar also, some discussion are going, how can we be connected to Myanmar also. India want to create an energy base, not only for our domestic consumer, also for the neighboring countries. So India is proactive for a common energy platform for the Asian countries. that beyond in the gas sector, as everybody has mentioned, what is the future? Yes, renewable is a emerging area, I appreciate, but for a longer period, for 2-3 more decades, gas will be a new source of energy for this part of the world. And we are creating an alliance with Japan, with Korea, with China and India. If all these 4 countries can come together, we will be determining the world energy economics for a longer period. And India is forefront of all such initiatives.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to pool a couple of questions together. Theme, nuclear and financing for alternatives. For the question comes from a member from Sun Edison, a solar enthusiast by his own description, who says, why are we doubling down on nuclear power in India when other countries, including Japan or Germany, are trying to get rid of nuclear energy power plants? A related question, which was directed to Andreas Cremer, was in that assessment of nuclear energy as completely, with poor economics, had you factored in the environmental costs of fossil fuels and the pollution and global warming that they cause? The related new energy, new financing for new energy question is simply whether you could look at how new projects could be financed by the reserves of the likes of pension funds in India.
So maybe we can start with the question on nuclear.
If I understood why you were moving towards nuclear power, because we want to diversify our energy basket. Beyond nuclear, India is positioning for 175 gigawatt of alternative energy. It's not nuclear. But we can't shy out from the nuclear energy. Yes, we want to have some portion of nuclear energy in our basket, but primarily India is focusing on the new energy and the renewable energy. Regarding finance, Neelkanth will answer.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, I'd like to comment on that. I think nuclear has become such a big part of policy here because it makes sense. To some extent, and in particular because, as I mentioned, you need a base load. You can't have only renewables. Until we have massive storage of electricity, which is possible, you're going to need some form of electricity production which can be carried on pretty much non-stop. And typically, the 2 technologies that are used are coal and nuclear. Of course, coal is difficult in India because most of it is produced in the east and the production difficulties make it not available in the west. So you're importing a lot in the west. Also, there are some quality issues. There's an issue which I'm happy to see has been changed in the Indian policy. Also, while the coal-fired plants are relatively young overall, the fleet has continued to construct subcritical coal-fired power plants, and the decision was made recently to require supercritical, and I hope a little bit more washing of coal before it's burned. Anyway, there are already some improvements in the coal sector. On the nuclear side, 2 things. First of all, India has a relatively unique reservoir of thorium, which opens up possibilities in India that other countries don't have. And secondly, the loosening, there was for a very long time constraints on the development of India's nuclear sector, and those have started to be relaxed since 2008, 2009, so that now you have access to fuel and to some extent some technologies. That didn't stop, okay. I just wanted to say that for thorium, basically, what India has been focusing on is developing the thorium fuel cycle, which is really unique and will be much more sustainable. It's much less dangerous for the environment than the uranium cycle. And so I think it makes a lot of sense, and it could be quite unique in the world.
Let me, if I may, just a quick comment. The risks of nuclear are clear. On the other hand, nuclear is a relatively clean, environmentally clean technology. So is gas relative to coal. Paradoxically, coal is now cheaper than gas, and many of these mixed cycles power plants are now using, again, coal. The price is such that coal is now cheaper, and they find it advantageous to use that. In the Middle East, the introduction of nuclear electricity power stations transcends from economics. And therefore it has such an implication that so far no country has done that, and I think that's reasonable given the circumstances in that region.
Yeah, and just to close that issue, the question, it has to be of relevance as well. Right now we get 1% of our energy from nuclear. If even say 6 gigawatts or 10 gigawatts is added, in the larger scheme of things, I think gas and renewables will actually have a much bigger role to play. But I'm told we are completely out of time, and therefore my apologies for curtailing it, but we are all available around in the conference, and if there are any questions that we were unable to answer, please do reach out. So
can I still answer the question that was directed at me, or is that
please
also
go ahead.
ruled
Go ahead.
out?
No, please.
Yeah. Thank you, because it actually doesn't close the issue. It's a common trick that is played by the lobbyists of the incumbent fossil and nuclear industry, that they always compare with one another, and they say that if you phase down nuclear, have you considered the cost of fossil fuel? Or if you do away with fossil fuel, how are you going to do the base load? Ladies and gentlemen, that is a completely false controversy. Nuclear is not economical. It's a waste. I don't deny India the right to have nuclear power plants. That is something you can have. You can have nuclear weapons as far as I'm concerned, but don't delude yourself by saying that it is economical. It is not, and it won't be better with thorium. I can send you, Your Excellency, a study that was done a few years ago by the UK's, United Kingdom's Nuclear Regulatory Authority, comparing the uranium cycle and the thorium cycle, and they say if uranium is bad, thorium is far worse. So yes, and if you look at all the environmental cost, then fossil gets even more expensive. At least we have a carbon price in Europe and in other parts of the world, but nuclear is also dirty. It has carbon dioxide emissions that are 7 times those of the wind industry, and every 5 to 7 years we have a core melt, and then we get very different types, very dangerous types of pollution. So the language that says nuclear is clean is simply a lie. Thank you.
Let me
Yes, sure.
answer.
Yeah.
Those who has created a huge pollution, huge burden in environment in the western part, they should not teach us what should be my base load. India is about what should be my base load. What kind of coal I have, I will be content with that. No country in recent past has positioned himself the way Prime Minister Modi has positioned himself, with projection of 175 gigawatt renewable energy we want to produce. And we have substantially, last 2 financial, if you go by any Indian balance sheet, we have proven that it's not a talk only. It's a deliverables we have done in field. So I'm grateful to my friend's analysis. I'm not biased with any kind of energy. I need cheaper energy for large segment of my society. I know my emerging economy is I'm aspiring economy. I know how to create my basket. That's my point.
Thank you, man. That is very clear. So on that note, thank you everyone for being a patient audience, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Minister, for gracing us with your presence. Thank you.